Victoria threw the heavy box of stone samples at my feet, the dust staining my steel-toed boots in front of the entire office. "I don't care how long you've been fetching coffee here. We don't need an errand girl on a senior director's salary," she sneered. She had no idea that those dusty boots were the only thing holding her multi-million-dollar supply chain together, but she was about to find out exactly how much a real foundation costs. The lobby of Vertex Architectural Materials was a masterpiece of polished marble and brushed brass, a stark contrast to the heavy dust-covered crate I was currently hauling toward the freight elevator. At 37, I had spent the last decade building relationships with the most exclusive quarries in Europe. I didn't care about getting my hands dirty. It was part of the job. But Victoria, the newly appointed regional director, cared only about optics. She stepped out of the glass-walled boardroom, her pristine white designer suit radiating a sterile corporate authority. She stopped in her tracks, eyeing me up and down. I wore my usual work uniform, durable denim, a practical linen shirt, and scuffed boots. To her, I was an eyesore in her modernized lobby. "Excuse me," Victoria snapped, her voice carrying across the open floor plan. "Why is a delivery person dragging freight through the main lobby during client hours?" I paused, setting the heavy crate down gently. I'm Amanda. I'm the senior procurement liaison. These are the exclusive travertine samples for the Lumina Hotel project. They needed to be handled personally." Victoria let out a short, condescending laugh. "Senior liaison, you look like a warehouse temp, and you're clearly doing the job of an errand girl." Several junior designers paused their conversations, turning to watch the spectacle. I kept my posture relaxed, looking her directly in the eye. "The artisans in Carrara don't ship via standard freight. I handle these because they trust me. Trust is irrelevant. Efficiency is what matters," Victoria said coldly. "Vertex is restructuring. I reviewed the payroll this morning. We are paying a premium salary for someone who acts as a glorified courier. Effective immediately, your position is eliminated. Leave the box. HR will email your severance details." She didn't wait for a response, simply turning on her heel and marching back into the boardroom. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I looked at the crate of travertine, knowing the delicate negotiations it represented, and calmly picked up my jacket. If she wanted to run a supply chain without the supplier's trust, she was welcome to try. My office wasn't in the main executive suite. It was a chaotic but organized space tucked near the logistics bay, filled with material catalogs, international shipping manifests, and handwritten notes in Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. I began packing my personal belongings into a small cardboard box. Julian, a junior coordinator who often helped me translate complex customs documents, hovered in the doorway. He looked panicked. "Amanda, is it true? Did she actually fire you?" I carefully wrapped a small hand-carved stone sculpture, a gift from a vendor in Tuscany, and placed it in my box. "Yes, Julian. Victoria has decided the company no longer needs my particular set of skills." "But the Lumina Hotel project," Julian stammered, stepping into the room. "The developers are expecting the first major shipment of bespoke brass fixtures next week. You're the only one who has direct contact with the foundry in Milan." "They don't even use email half the time, I know," I said softly, handing him a thick folder. "That's why you need to keep this. It's the standard operating procedure for international freight. But Julian, understand this. Do not put your own job on the line trying to cover for Victoria's mistake. Just do what you are assigned to do." I wasn't going to let Victoria's arrogance ruin my career, but I also wasn't going to set the building on fire on my way out. The fire would start all on its own. As I carried my box through the main floor, I saw Victoria chatting animatedly with two of her new hires, recent graduates, in sharp suits who knew everything about spreadsheets and nothing about raw materials. She didn't even glance my way. By the time I reached my car, the shock had completely faded, replaced by a cold, practical clarity. I sat in the driver's seat, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number in Milan. "Enzo," I said when the gruff voice answered. "It's Amanda. I have some news regarding Vertex. We need to discuss the future of our working relationship." The first week of my forced unemployment was surprisingly productive. I didn't waste time mourning a job at a company that no longer respected the work I did. Instead, I transformed my spare bedroom into a fully functional home office. I registered a new LLC, Amanda Lane Consulting, specializing in bespoke architectural procurement. At 37, I had a Rolodex that was worth its weight in gold, and I knew how to use it. Back at Vertex, Victoria was busy implementing her grand vision. According to Julian, who texted me updates on his lunch breaks, she had outsourced the entire vendor communication process to an automated digital portal. She sent out generic emails to master craftsmen demanding they upload their invoices and shipping schedules to a cloud server. She expected artisans who had been carving stone and casting metal for generations to suddenly comply with a sterile corporate ticketing system. It was predictably disastrous. By Wednesday, 3 major European suppliers had completely stopped responding to Vertex. Enzo, the head of the foundry in Milan, had called me directly. "This woman, Victoria, she sends me a digital form with a barcode." Enzo had ranted in broken English. "I do not work for a barcode. I work with people. I work with you, Amanda." I had calmly explained my new business venture to him. I didn't ask him to break any contracts with Vertex side. I didn't need to. I knew that the exclusivity agreement Vertex had with Enzo's foundry had expired 3 weeks ago. I had been in the process of negotiating the renewal when Victoria fired me. Without my signature on the updated terms, Enzo was a free agent. "Send me the new contract, Amanda," Enzo had said. "We go where you go." I spent Thursday afternoon drafting an independent supplier agreement for Enzo, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I wasn't stealing clients. I was simply providing a home for the relationships I had personally cultivated. Victoria wanted an efficient, faceless machine. She was about to learn that in the world of luxury materials, personal respect was the only currency that truly mattered. 2 weeks after my departure, the cracks in Victoria's polished new system began to show. The Lumina Hotel developers were demanding updates on the bespoke brass fixtures and the custom-cut travertine for their grand lobby. These materials were the centerpiece of a $50 million project, and they were already 5 days late. Julian told me that Victoria's office had become a war zone. She paced behind the glass walls, yelling into her phone, demanding her new hires track down the shipments. But there were no tracking numbers. The automated portal she had spent thousands of dollars implementing showed only a blank screen for the Milan foundry. They hadn't uploaded a single document. I sat at my kitchen island sipping black coffee and reviewing a direct procurement proposal for a boutique architecture firm in Chicago. My new business was already gaining traction. My phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but I recognized the corporate prefix of Vertex Architectural Materials. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Amanda Lane speaking. "Amanda, this is Victoria." Her voice was tight-stripped of the condescending drawl she had used in the lobby 2 weeks ago. "We seem to have an administrative glitch with the Milan foundry. They aren't responding to our portal requests." "I see," I replied, my tone perfectly neutral. "That sounds like a difficult situation." "It's unacceptable is what it is," Victoria snapped, her arrogance flaring back up. "I need you to forward me the direct contact numbers for the warehouse managers, the ones you were hoarding before you left." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "I didn't hoard anything, Victoria. All official vendor contact information was saved on the central server, exactly as company policy dictates." "Those numbers go to a receptionist who doesn't speak English," she practically shouted. "I need the direct lines, the cell phones." "Those are personal numbers," I explained calmly, "given to me through years of mutual trust. They aren't company property. Furthermore, I no longer work for Vertex. I'm afraid I can't help you resolve your administrative glitch." I hung up gently, leaving her to the silence. Hanging up on Victoria wasn't just satisfying. It was a necessary boundary. I knew exactly what she was trying to do. She wanted to extract my expertise for free to patch the sinking ship she had torpedoed. But my focus was solely on my own future now. By the end of the month, Amanda Lane Consulting had officially signed 3 of the top European suppliers, including Enzo's foundry and the Carrera travertine quarry. They had all refused to sign Victoria's automated impersonal vendor agreements. Instead, they signed exclusive distribution rights over to my new firm. The relief in their voices when they realized they could continue doing business the old-fashioned way with respect, direct communication, and a handshake that meant something was palpable. I spent my days visiting local architectural firms presenting my portfolio. Without the massive overhead of a corporate giant like Vertex, I could offer them better prices for the exact same premium materials with a guarantee of personal oversight on every single shipment. I wore my practical jeans, my linen shirts, and my comfortable boots. Nobody called me an errand girl. They called me a lifesaver. Meanwhile, the situation at Vertex was turning catastrophic. Julian texted me a picture of the Lumina Hotel project board in the Vertex conference room. It was covered in red warning tape. The developers had issued a formal breach of contract warning. If Vertex couldn't produce the Italian materials by Friday, they would cancel the entire multimillion-dollar procurement deal. Victoria had tried to source replacement materials from a cheaper supplier in a desperate bid to save the timeline, but the Lumina developers were paying for exclusive artisanal quality, not mass-produced copies. When the developers reviewed the cheap samples Victoria presented, they were furious. Victoria was rapidly learning that a title on a business card couldn't command loyalty, and a cloud-based portal couldn't carve stone. She had mistaken my quiet competence for low status, failing to realize that true power in this industry didn't sit behind a glass desk. True power was out in the field wearing steel-toed boots, holding the trust of the craftsman. On Wednesday morning, a sleek black town car pulled into the driveway of my modest suburban home. I watched from my home office window as Victoria stepped out, wearing a sharp charcoal suit that looked completely out of place in my quiet neighborhood. She marched up to my front door and rang the bell sharply. I took a deep breath, smoothed my sweater, and opened the door. I didn't invite her inside. I simply stood in the doorway, waiting. Amanda, Victoria said, attempting a smile that looked more like a grimace. "We need to talk. You drove a long way for a conversation we already had on the phone," I replied evenly. She sighed, shifting her weight. "Look, I will admit that there was a miscommunication during the transition. The Lumina project is critical, and the Milan foundry is being incredibly stubborn. They're claiming they no longer have a contract with Vertex. That's because they don't," I said plainly. "The exclusivity agreement expired 3 weeks before you fired me. I had drafted the renewal, but you eliminated my position before I could execute it." Victoria's face went pale. "They're legally bound to finish the project. They are legally bound to deliver goods upon receipt of a valid contract and a deposit," I corrected her. "Your automated system rejected their standard invoice format, so the deposit was never paid. They are free to sell that brass to anyone." Victoria's eyes darted around, panic finally breaking through her corporate mask. "I will offer you a 6-month consulting contract, double your old salary. You come back, you fix this mess with Enzo, and we get the Lumina shipment on the water by Friday." It was a lot of money. A few weeks ago it might have been tempting. But I looked at Victoria, seeing the desperation underneath her arrogance. She still didn't respect me. She only needed me to save her own career. "I'm not a freelancer looking for a gig, Victoria. I run my own procurement firm now." I stepped back to close the door. Good luck with the Lumina developers. The fallout was swift and spectacular. The Lumina Hotel developers were not known for their patience. They were a conglomerate of high-profile investors who demanded perfection. When Friday arrived and the bespoke materials were nowhere to be found, they called an emergency meeting at their downtown headquarters. I knew about the meeting because I had been invited. 2 days prior, I had reached out to the lead architect of the Lumina project, a woman named Sarah, whom I had worked with on several past developments. I explained my new independent status and informed her that I held the exclusive distribution rights for the specific Milanese brass and Italian travertine she had selected. I didn't disparage Vertex. I simply presented a solution to her very expensive problem. When I arrived at the developer's sleek boardroom, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The investor sat on one side of the massive oak table, looking furious. Victoria sat on the other side, flanked by her 2 nervous junior hires. She was mid-sentence trying to spin a narrative about global shipping delays and unforeseen supply chain bottlenecks. I knocked quietly on the open glass door and stepped inside. I wore a tailored navy blazer over my usual practical clothes, holding a leather portfolio. Victoria stopped talking. Her eyes widened as she recognized me. "What is she doing here?" Victoria demanded, her voice shrill. "She doesn't work for Vertex." "I know," said Sarah, the lead architect, gesturing for me to take the empty seat at the head of the table. "Amanda is here as our guest. Since Vertex has failed to secure the materials specified in our contract, we have been forced to look for alternative procurement options." "Alternative options?" Victoria scoffed, standing up. "Nobody else can source that specific metalwork in time. We just need a few more days to sort out the vendor paperwork." I opened my leather portfolio and slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward the investors. It was a guaranteed shipping manifest from the Milan foundry. "The brass is already packed," I said calmly. "It ships tomorrow." The boardroom fell entirely silent. The lead investor, a stern man with silver hair, adjusted his glasses and looked down at the shipping manifest I had just provided. He then looked up at me, a glimmer of genuine respect in his eyes. "You have direct control over this shipment, Ms. Lane?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I replied evenly. "Amanda Lane Consulting holds the exclusive rights to distribute for the Milan foundry and the Carrera Travertine quarry in this region. If we finalize our agreement today, the materials will arrive precisely on your original construction schedule." Victoria's face turned an ugly shade of crimson. She slammed her hands onto the table. "This is corporate sabotage. You stole our vendors." I turned to look at her, my expression calm and unbothered. "I didn't steal anything, Victoria. Your vendor contracts expired. You refused to communicate with the artisans, you insulted their processes, and you failed to pay their deposits. They simply chose to do business with a firm that respects them." "You were a mid-level employee," Victoria hissed, dropping all pretense of professional composure. "You don't have the infrastructure to handle a $50 million account." "I have the only infrastructure that matters." I fired back, my voice steady and firm. "Trust, reliability, and competence. You fired me because I didn't fit your aesthetic idea of a corporate executive. You thought hauling samples and talking to foremen made me an errand girl. But in this industry, the foundation is built on the ground, not in a glass office." The investors exchanged knowing looks. Sarah, the lead architect, leaned forward. "Victoria, Vertex is officially in breach of contract. We are terminating our procurement agreement with your firm effective immediately. We will be retaining Amanda's consultancy to oversee the remainder of the supply chain." Victoria stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as the reality of the situation washed over her. Her flagship project, the cornerstone of her new corporate strategy, was gone. And it was gone because she had thrown away the one person who actually understood how the pieces fit together. The dismantling of Victoria's authority was brutal and public. By the time I left the Lumina developer's office with a signed contract in my portfolio, the news had already reached the Vertex board of directors. A loss of a $50 million account wasn't something that could be hidden behind corporate buzzwords or spun into a positive learning experience. It was a catastrophic failure of leadership. I drove back to my home office, the weight of the last month finally lifting from my shoulders. I hadn't set out to destroy Victoria's career. I had simply protected my own livelihood and honored the relationships I had spent a decade building. Victoria's arrogance had been the architect of her own downfall. I had merely stepped out of the way before the building collapsed. Later that afternoon, Julian called me. He was practically whispering into the phone from his cubicle. "Amanda, it's a bloodbath over here. The board members just left Victoria's office. They looked furious. HR is down there right now with a cardboard box." I felt a brief flicker of pity, but it vanished quickly. Victoria had gleefully handed me a cardboard box just a few weeks ago, fully expecting me to disappear into obscurity. She had underestimated the strength of a woman who knew her own worth. "Are you okay, Julian?" I asked. "I'm fine," he said. "Actually, I wanted to ask if your new consultancy needs an assistant logistics coordinator. I'd rather work for someone who actually knows what they're doing." I smiled, looking at the mountain of new paperwork on my desk. Send me your resume tonight, Julian. We'll talk. I hung up the phone and looked out my window. The sun was shining. My business was legitimate, profitable, and growing faster than I had ever anticipated. I had taken the worst moment of my professional life and turned it into the foundation of my own independence. I wasn't just an employee anymore. I was the boss, and I would never let anyone treat me like an errand girl ever again. 3 months later, Amanda Lane Consulting was operating out of a bright, open-plan office in the Arts District. We weren't a massive corporate giant, but we were highly specialized, highly respected, and incredibly busy. Julian sat at the front desk expertly handling a complex customs dispute in fluent Spanish while I reviewed the final installation photos from the Lumina Hotel lobby. The space looked magnificent. The custom brass fixtures gleamed under the bespoke lighting, and the travertine floors were flawless. The developers were ecstatic, and they had already retained my firm for their next 2 commercial projects. The industry is surprisingly small, and word travels fast. I heard through the grapevine that Victoria had quietly resigned from Vertex after the board stripped her of her regional director title. Her grand modernization project was abandoned, and the company was frantically trying to repair its damaged reputation. She had learned a very hard lesson about the difference between managing a spreadsheet and managing people. I walked over to the coffee machine, poured myself a cup, and leaned against the counter, taking in the quiet hum of my own company. I didn't wear a designer suit to work. I still wore my comfortable jeans, my linen shirts, and when I needed to visit a warehouse, I put on my steel-toed boots. I didn't need to dress up to prove my authority. My authority was written in the contracts on my desk and the trust of the partners who stood by me. When you know the actual value of your work, you don't need anyone else's validation. I raised my coffee cup in a quiet, solitary toast, not to revenge, but to resilience, to the knowledge that true expertise can never be fired and true respect can never be faked. It has to be earned stone by stone, day by day. And my foundation was solid rock. True authority doesn't come from a fancy job title or an expensive suit. It comes from competence, respect, and the actual value you bring to the table. Never let an arrogant person diminish your worth just because they don't understand the heavy lifting you do behind the scenes. Have you ever been underestimated by a boss who judged you entirely by appearances? Drop your story in the comments below and don't forget to like and subscribe. For more stories of sweet, well-deserved karma,